Welcome to the second presentation for the 2022-23 season of Avalanche Canada's webinar series. We had a couple of issues in recording this session on November 9th, so we're going to record it again without a live audience. My name is Brent Strand, and I'm the producer for this evening. Thank you for joining us. Over the past 2 years, we presented a variety of webinars and found that being online means we get to share our avalanche safety messaging with even more of you than before. We're glad you're with us this evening, and we'd love to see you share these webinars with others throughout the winter. Our mission is to help educate backcountry users so you can go out and play safe. We want you to know more, go further, and come home. First, we'd like to acknowledge that our session is being hosted in the territory of 4 nations, the Sinnix, the Secwepemc, the Ktunaxa, and the Silks. As a national organization, we also acknowledge the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit nations whose land we live and recreate on. Before we start tonight's session, I'd like to thank our sponsors. We're very grateful for our sponsors being loyal in their support for us during these challenging economic times. This webinar tonight is sponsored by ISMA, International Snowmobile Manufacturers Association. ISMA has been a longtime sponsor of Avalanche Canada, helping us with snowmobile owners and purchases of our various field teams over the years. Their support has been key to our expansion and delivering public safety. So today's presentation, summits, Stoke, and 2-stroke, strategies for a safe season. Winter has finally started to arrive and Stoke is high. Everyone is itching to get out and play in the snow. We want to help set you up for success this evening and give you a few tips for how to manage that early season enthusiasm. Stoke is good, but it's important to know some of the hazards to avoid both in the early season and throughout the winter, so you can enjoy many days out there. Our presenter this evening is Jen Coulter, Avalanche Canada Field Team Supervisor, and for the past 10 years, a field team member on our South Rockies team. Jen spends many days each winter on a sled, assessing snow, looking for the best riding lines, avoiding pitfalls, and tonight she's going to share this knowledge with you. She has also worked as a search and rescue technician and loves to sneak in photos of her avalanche rescue dog into her presentations, so be on the lookout. She will talk about some basic messages we should all be thinking of right now, some sled-specific considerations, and she will touch on a sledder near miss from last season. We're so glad she's agreed to share time with us tonight. So keep the stoke high, but let's balance it out with being smart out there. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Jen.
Thanks, Brent. I'm just going to work on sharing my screen here. Great. Just confirm that I'm all good there, Brent?
Yeah, looks great, Jen.
Awesome. Okay, thanks for that great introduction. So let's kind of get started on how we can employ some solid strategies to keep ourselves safe this season while retaining that stoke that really fuels our sledding passion. Okay. So hopefully I'm talking to a bunch of powder hounds, and we're going to look at a daily process that preserves that stoke without sacrificing safety. We're going to look at what's up with our new forecasting system because there's some big changes happening this year. We'll look at some sled specific considerations for each part of this daily process. I'm going to link to a case study, and then we'll kind of sum things up with a bit on how you can make a difference in your sled community. So let's jump in. This is the daily process that you learn about in avalanche skills training courses, and it closely mirrors the analysis that professionals use to structure their day. And going through this process each day, you plan on hitting the backcountry. I think it's what helps us develop those healthy habits so we can make the most of our riding days, but kind of come home safe and do it all over again. And I mentioned there was something new at Avalanche Canada this year, and that's in the number 1 of the process here. It's the get the forecast part. So it's still available at avalanche.ca. Nothing's new there. And we are still going to have it available on your phone, although we are doing an app update. So there might be some things to work out for a little bit with the phone app. But what's really new is this concept of flexible forecast regions. So in the past, you saw an icon in the forecast regions, but now they're colored to reflect each of the region's highest danger ratings. And these colors are based on the North American Public Avalanche Danger Scale. So because these regions are flexible now, they're no longer fixed, so they no longer have names. So we used to have the North Rockies and the Purcells and the Columbias, and now they don't have names. So what we've done is we've added this search bar at the top to make finding your riding area really easy. You can search using mountain ranges, peaks, drainages, or even kind of popular riding areas. So you could just type in, Renshaw or Frisbee, and it'll pull up the correct avalanche bulletin for your zone. We're covering the same area that we always have, but the size and shape of the regions is actually now going to be determined by avalanche conditions. And so those boundaries will change in response to those conditions. One of the reasons we're making these changes is to tackle one of our biggest problems with the old systems, where conditions would often vary significantly across some of our larger systems. And with these new flexible regions, it allows us to kind of reflect conditions more accurately. So even though the way we kind of create and display the forecast regions is changing, we're not changing the methods we use to turn your data into actual avalanche forecasts. And the structure and layout of the forecast itself, the bulletin, won't change. You can expect kind of the same information in detail as you always have, just hopefully tailored a little bit more closely to your recreation zone. So we're dropping a link right now into the chat box, just a video kind of on the flexible forecast regions that you can refer to and share with friends if people are asking, what's up? Why does it look different? So that kind of brings us to number 2 in the daily process. And when we plan our trips, we're actually looking for suitable objectives that match the conditions that we read about in the avalanche forecast. And one way we can do that is to do some research online that helps kind of us figure out what local conditions are like. I'm going to talk about how we can use some social media to give us kind of visual representations of things we see in the avalanche forecast. So it's no secret that social media can kind of be toxic at times. So how could we use the power of social media for trip planning and hopefully avoid its pitfalls at the same time? That's something I kind of think a lot about. And I want to start here. If you recreate in an area with an Avalanche Canada field team, you're going to want to follow them on social media and look for their posts on the Mountain Information Network, because it's actually a really good source of professional grade information to supplement your trip planning. All of our field teams are Sled based. I mean, you will see them on skis sometimes. We serve a variety of target audiences. But my point is they're often thinking about terrain from a sledder perspective. And they're working hard to bring you the types of information you see in the bulletin. They're trying to bring those to life with their creative posts. So let's say the avalanche forecast is talking about a wind slab problem. They're going to kind of take a show don't tell approach and try and help you figure out where those problems are, what they look like. Maybe the avalanche forecast is talking about an emerging persistent avalanche problem. You can kind of follow the life cycle of that layer along with the field team. The other thing we try and do is just kind of lay out how we're using risk management to kind of match our terrain selection to the avalanche danger in the bulletin. And, this is just an example where the team was using small slopes with no consequence to kind of test a weak layer that was referred to in the bulletin to help make decisions on what kind of terrain selection they should use. And in this case, it was pretty obvious they weren't going to access any bigger slopes that day. So this is where we had field teams. We had one on Vancouver Island, one in the Northwest, kind of in Smithers, but also going into the Terrace area quite a bit. We have a team in the North Rockies, the South Rockies, the Yukon, and even Newfoundland. So even if you don't get to these areas that often, I think it's a great idea to kind of follow them in social media and kind of build your curiosity. And hopefully, once you do recreate in those zones, you'll have a better understanding of how the bulletin relates to the conditions in the field. There's some other examples of avalanche industry grade information that's available on social media. So a lot of avalanche course providers are on social media and they share information about conditions. Same with snowmobile guides. Even some search and rescue groups often share conditions reports once in a while. And what all these people have in common is they've all had some professional level avalanche training. They actually really care about public avalanche safety, and they want to encourage your curiosity and learning. I think having them in your feeds can also remind you to take that next step and like level up for that new avalanche course, or maybe like, I should take a companion rescue refresher, for example, or even maybe to hire a guide to help demystify making terrain choices that kind of match the avalanche hazard, especially maybe in a new riding zone for you. So we're just dropping a link in the chat box right now about how you can find a snowmobile specific avalanche training course provider. So one thing you'll hear repeatedly early season, you'll hear it from Avalanche Canada, but also from a lot of these sled content providers, is we make more conservative trip plans when we don't know as much about the snowpack. And this is not only because there may be early season weak layers and we're still kind of gathering information and figuring out where they are and how they're bonding, but also, because using rocks and stumps as traction, it can have consequences, and not just for the pocketbook. We don't want to have to deal with any kind of season ending injuries before things have even gotten started. So I think it's easy to assign some credibility to those professional sources of trip planning information on social media. But, sometimes people ask me, like, how do we consider recreational or like our fellow kind of community sources when we're doing that trip planning? And I often think about how to weight that evidence from those sources. So if someone's posting photos or videos of recent human triggered or natural avalanches, I consider that like bullseye, high strength, important information, and I will trust it and promptly use it to update my knowledge of conditions. Even more so, I think if I see it coming from a variety of sources, because in that case, we're actually adding weight to that high strength information. And in this case, it doesn't really matter to me who's reporting it and what their level of training is. I can see things have reached a tipping point and I need to pay attention to that bullseye information. I think, aside from that bullseye information, maybe a good way to look at it is, if you don't know their level of training, take the observations, like how much new snow was there? Was it windy? Use those to help develop your trip plans, but don't necessarily take their analysis. Like if somebody was saying, feels really stable out there or something, I wouldn't necessarily take that analysis over the analysis in the Avalanche Bulletin or other professional sources, but there's still lots of good information in there. So I did mention social media can be a bit toxic, and I recognize not everybody watching uses social media. I just want to remind you of the Mountain Information Network. We often call it the MIN. And the field teams and a lot of these course providers, they're using the Mountain Information Network to share their posts, as well as your fellow riders. If you go to avalanche.ca on the map, all these blue dots are Mountain Information Network posts. So you could go to an area you're interested in riding and in your trip plan and look at some of these posts to help you make a plan that matches the conditions for the day. Okay, so we kind of looked at getting the forecast, planning your trip, and now we're going to hone in on checking the gear. So this is probably review for a lot of you, but transceiver, shovel, probe are essential gear for mountain riding. Obviously, having it is only the first part. You actually have to know how to use it because every second really does count. For those of you that have been in a real rescue situation, you know there's never enough practice that we can do. I've worked hard to make it part of my crew's culture to practice often and to be okay making mistakes and asking questions in practice, because I actually teach professional level avalanche search and rescue courses, and I'm still always learning new things all the time. I'm actually quite curious to hear from your community and how you convince your crew to kind of keep up their rescue practice, because it can be a challenge. On top of the essential gear, there's a whole host of recommended gear. Not just the things listed here, like, airbags, radios, satellite communicators, but also that kind of equipment you need to deal with for stucks, injuries, repairs, spending the night. We're dropping a link to a good article on that kind of gear list in case you want a refresher early season into the chat box. So don't forget your early season checks to ensure that the equipment is in good working order. For example, corrosion in the battery compartment of transceivers, it's been implicated in avalanche fatalities in the past. We take batteries out in the spring, inspect the transceiver before putting fresh ones in. There's also been a variety of transceiver recalls in the last year. So yeah, check with your manufacturer on those. As well, many transceivers have software updates, so you want to make sure you have the most recent software update for your transceiver. And then put your probe and shovel together and set up and test your air. We don't want to find out that they don't work, when you actually need them. And then finally, making just a little plug for checklists. I use a checklist on the shop door. Sledding is really gear intensive, and I take my gear out and dry it and try and take good care of it at the end of each day. And I need to make sure it gets all back in the kit and out with me in the field. So think about putting a checklist somewhere where you'll actually review it. Okay. So once we get in the field, we actually need to figure out if the conditions match the avalanche forecast and our trip plan, because we may have some adjusting to do. I'm actually going to linger in this section because I think this is really where the rubber meets the road. So no matter what the avalanche bulletin says or what we decided in our trip plan, it's still our responsibility to kind of keep good situational awareness and adjust for the actual conditions we see in the field. Just because we're on machines that move quickly and they're loud, it doesn't mean we can just kind of turn off the rest of our senses when we're in avalanche terrain. Noticing the changes in conditions, that's important, but so is actually communicating that with our crew and seeing what they're noticing as well. To me, I think good communication in the backcountry, it's just as important a travel habit as spreading out to cross avalanche paths or riding in avalanche terrain one at a time while your crew watches from a safe spot. And I think, radios are great. We use them all the time, but there are times we need to have that kind of engines off, helmets off check-ins and a little bit more nuanced conversation. And so I'm just going to touch on a couple times I have those engines off, helmets off discussions. This is not an extensive list, just a couple of examples. So one of those communication times for me is when we see changes in conditions or something unexpected. So again, just because that machine is loud, it doesn't mean we can't figuratively be listening. So ignoring communicating something like shooting cracks, let's say, which we also call whoomphing, it can have serious consequences because it's essentially an avalanche that's happened in terrain that's not steep enough to slide. And We touched on how it's kind of best practice to be verifying conditions on small, less committing terrain features. So if you're seeing those kinds of things there, you want to actually let your crew know before you move into terrain where it could actually have life-changing consequences. You don't want to be like, oh, I thought you saw those cracks too and would know not to go there. We want to have had those discussions in advance. Now, I used shooting cracks as an example, but it could be something like noticing, wow, it's a lot windier than was forecasted. I see a lot of snow on the move, or temperatures, that sun's really having more of an effect on the snowpack than I thought. These kind of the conditions are always dynamic and changing in the backcountry, and they could and should have an effect on your goals for the day. So another time I think it's really good to have those helmets off, engines off discussions is when changing compaction zones. And I guess I've kind of come to this realization because we did a study with Avalanche Canada a few years ago where we interviewed and did surveys with sled guides who have high levels of avalanche training. And they kind of let us know that there's a real potential to overestimate our avalanche risk management skills when we're moving from more compacted terrain into less compacted terrain. And, they agreed that finding ways to talk about this topic could actually have a really positive effect on avalanche safety. So here we are talking about it. So let's start kind of with a simple definition, idea of compaction, so we're all on the same page. The snowpack has layers in it. And when we get these big firm layers of snow over a weak layer of snow, that's the recipe for a slab avalanche. However, if when this kind of feathery surface hoar crystal layer was on the surface or only buried by a few centimeters, if we could actually track that all up with our sleds, we could kind of penetrate and impact that weak layer. We would disrupt that failure plane, and that would affect slab cohesion. And we could potentially mitigate the surface hoar layer from becoming a potential avalanche problem in some areas down the road. However, it can be really tricky. We might be able to penetrate and affect this layer, but if nobody was around early season to compact this lower weak layer and all the compaction happened here, we still could be just building a large slab over this potential weak layer. So that's one of the ways that compaction is actually quite tricky. I guess kind of I'm advocating that we find ways as sledders to talk about this kind of thing. And one of the ways we could do that is maybe by creating some common labels we talk about in our groups. This idea came up in interviews in our study where, especially around managed sled zones, there's these areas where you're very likely to find extremely elaborate and consistent compaction. And we kind of talked about naming those kind of the core areas. And then we also know that there's areas, they could be within managed sled zones, but also outside of them, where we actually can expect a really intact seasonal snowpack that's really uninfluenced by compaction, even if it does get a track now and again on an occasional basis. And we kind of flirted with calling those wilderness zones. And then there's the hard part, kind of that in-between terrain where there may be lots of tracks at some periods, but access isn't really consistent enough to put that much weight in it. In fact, there may be some points where the fact that there are some tracks in there can kind of falsely equate stability to people looking at that terrain. Like, well, people have been in there, nothing bad has happened. So I think this area is one of the trickier ones, that in-between zone. And here's the evidence for that. So in our experiment, we asked some of our subject matter experts to kind of do mock-ups of popular managed sled zones. And here we can see they've mocked up these green areas are the core kind of super elaborate compaction zones. And the pink are those wilderness kind of areas where the snowpack's pretty much intact. And then the blue are the in-between zones. And what we did is after they mocked these up, we overlaid where avalanche fatalities were. And it turns out a lot of them actually happen in those kind of in-between zones, kind of when people have moved from really compacted to less compacted areas. So I think that's something to kind of start talking about with your crew. Even if you feel like we're not seeing much for avalanche hazard in some of these compacted areas, don't let that lull you into a false sense of security and risk management. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to change gears and jump into a little case study. This is from last year in the Fernie area. It was a snowmobile triggered near miss in kind of a nasty piece of tree terrain. I just want to say a big thank you to the rider. He was really generous in letting us share this case study. So this rider and his crew, they went through the daily process. They checked the avalanche bulletin. This was January 2nd. And they noted that the avalanche danger was moderate in the alpine and tree line where they were looking to recreate. And the headline talked about avalanche danger potentially rising as the next storm blows in. Near the end of the day, you can see the forecast is going up for the next day. And there was also mention of a forecaster blog and managing this persistent slab problem. And this was a layer of sugary crystals over a crust that was buried almost a month before on December 4th. So now it was January 2nd. So they dug deeper than just the danger ratings into the problems tab, something we want everyone to do. And they noticed they were talking about wind slab problems as winds were supposed to precede the coming storm. And then in this persistent avalanche problem, the problem was down deeper in the snowpack, unlikely to possible for chances of avalanches, but large avalanches if you did trigger it. So size 2 to 3, definitely big enough to kill you, bury and kill you. And they talked about avoiding thin spots in this kind of low probability, high consequence scenario. So they'd looked at the avalanche forecast, they'd made a trip plan and ensured the crew had all the proper gear. And next they wanted to verify the conditions. This rider has invested a lot in their avalanche training and mentorship and understands kind of a process of lifelong learning. So they wanted to dig a snow pit in a representative area and look for the avalanche problems that were listed in the bulletin, like would they find wind affected snow at the top of the snowpack, and check on the status of that deeper persistent avalanche problem. Now, they walked down to this spot just below ridgetop, just mentioning this because they were actually wanting to access this slope from the top. They weren't approaching it from the bottom. So this is the kind of information that was in their field book, some of the information that they gathered. And they had no snowpack test results suggesting instability in the upper snowpack with that wind slab. Just weren't seeing any reactivity there. They got a little bit of confusing results, I'd say, non-consistent results on that deeper persistent weak layer. They did get one result in the hard range, and I'll circle back to that. But after looking at the snowpack, they kind of surmised that the problem was not really consistent and deep enough in the snowpack that they didn't think it would affect their riding. So what happened? The rider dropped in here off the ridge with the other members of the party staying in a safe spot on ridgetop and kind of headed for this opening in the treed chute and actually rode the slope twice and nothing happened. There was no signs of instability noted. In the third run there, the rider actually did a downhill carve over towards where their snow pit was, which was over in this area, and then kind of headed back to the chute and pointed downhill. And it was actually in the spot with the downhill carve where the slab was initiated, but the rider didn't really notice until they were kind of halfway down the chute and the slope was just moving around him. And he realized that there had been an avalanche, and he was able to kind of throttle out the bottom and managed not to be buried and his sled not to be damaged. I think he felt really lucky that he kind of had a clean run, that he wasn't somewhere in the trees or above the trees, because the slab was over 125 centimeters deep in places, and the avalanche ran for 600 meters, a lot of it through nasty tree terrain. And I don't have to tell you the type of trauma those trees can provide, and also kind of increase the chances of being buried as well. And the slide was big enough to bury a person for sure. So as we kind of look at the lessons learned, I think it's helpful to frame this. So I don't think it's super helpful to look for perfect objective truths of what went wrong and kind of fool ourselves into thinking with that hindsight bias that this could never have been me. Because of course, things always look simpler after the fact, kind of once all that uncertainty has been resolved and the outcome is before us. Yeah, it's all too easy for us just to dismiss a case and not learn very much from it because we're like, I would never do that. But I think instead, it's really important for us to ask, how could this have been me? And that helps guard against dismissing things due to that hindsight bias. And we may find places we can strengthen our kind of even seemingly simple systems that we take for granted, kind of increase the chances that we learn from our near misses and accidents, and those ones that others are kind of kind enough to share with us. So here's one about moderate danger. I actually want to say that this crew didn't just proceed like it was open season. They weren't just charging ahead. They actually understood and knew the danger card and recognized that they needed to carefully evaluate the terrain choice. And that's kind of what they were attempting to do with that snowpack assessment. So it's kind of evaluate snow and terrain carefully, identify features of concern. And we see this kind of matches the avalanche bulletin, where natural avalanches were unlikely, human triggered avalanches in that possible range. And even though they're talking mostly about small avalanches in specific areas, there's also potential for large avalanches in isolated areas. And I think moderate avalanche danger can be especially tricky with persistent avalanche problems. And here's just some evidence of that in the details section of the bulletin from that day, where the forecasters, they're saying things like, even though snowpack test results haven't been showing results, they remain wary. They're talking about, with this low probability, high consequence scenario, we still have to kind of head to those conservative terrain choices. The forecaster blog was also reflecting on that uncertainty at the time. Some people were actually riding big stuff and getting away with it, but then there was all these kind of spotty near misses happening. And persistent weak layers go through this cycle where we wait for them to become reactive, then they're pretty busy for a while and pretty easy to forecast or predict. But then activity on those layers kind of starts to taper off and it gets sporadic and the probability goes down. But the consequences often goes up because they usually have a bigger slab on top of them. Eventually the layers usually bond back together and then they're not an avalanche problem anymore and we pull them from the avalanche bulletin. But exactly when it's over can be tough to say. And I think like self-control, it's actually not that difficult in the short term, but it becomes increasingly challenging over time. So one way I like to kind of keep myself disciplined in these times is I try and think about choosing terrain where the consequences of my snowpack assessment being wrong will promote survivable outcomes. So if I'm going to take that little step out, further down the road, make sure it's a smaller slope or there's no terrain traps, those kinds of things. Okay, I'm going to get a bit nerdy here for a minute. The avalanche forecast made mention of thin spot triggering, and Bruce Jameson, he's a Canadian avalanche guru, he made a great animation to show us what this actually means. So imagine this is a skier in this case. There's like this bulb of stress that follows the skier around under him. And you could see we have some rocks, they could be stumps, whatever, a layer of snow. And you can imagine that this pink layer here is a persistent weak layer. And then we have a snowfall on top. And from the top of the surface, we can't really see where any of these thin spots are. So when the skier goes down the slope, those high stress areas, at first that stress bulb, it's not hitting the weak layer, But what happens when the skier gets to a thin spot? A crack starts, and in this case, the crack eventually will get long enough if they hit a thin spot with a persistent weak layer. It'll kind of shoot out in all directions, upslope as well. And then we're going to get crown fracture and a slab avalanche releases. Okay, but sledders also have stress bulbs. And in early research, we learned that skiers and sledders actually have similar stress bulbs because even though snowmobiles are much heavier, the surface area of the sled helps to spread out the weight. But we also have evidence that dynamic moves, such as like downhill carves and kind of big throttle braps trenching uphill, that makes for a stress bulb that penetrates deeper in the snowpack. So Ian Stewart Patterson and Jeremy Hankey, they actually performed this study where they looked at some of these dynamic moves because they understand that we don't just ride flat with consistent throttle through the mountains. So in this particular case study, I think it's interesting that the rider was doing a downhill carve when the avalanche was initiated. So like, was it the extra stress of the dynamic move or going over a thin spot in the terrain or some combination of the two? I mean, we don't know 100% for sure, but these are likely explanations for why he was able to ride the slope a couple of times and nothing happened. But then he hit one of those invisible trigger points and that low probability, high consequence avalanche was initiated. Okay, so I'm circling back now to the snowpack tests. I'm including something about it because it was a factor in this case. Early avalanche courses, they actually focus more on recognizing avalanche terrain, understanding the forecast, and selecting appropriate terrain choices. There's great decision-making tools like the one that the sledder's holding here that you get in the course that helps you kind of go through a matrix to choose terrain and make decisions without having to understand snowpack tests. But just because it was a case, part of this case, I just want to say that snowpack tests are a good tool for hunting for instability in the snowpack. And they're really good for learning about the snowpack and how it relates to the avalanche bulletin. But what they're not good at is, we need time to learn how to do snowpack tests and to interpret them. That takes time. They're not really a good tool for ruling in terrain because we have the potential to get false positive results because of, spatial variability. So just because I don't get results in one place doesn't mean I should consider my line good to go. So in this particular case, they did get a result on a persistent weak layer in one of their tests that suggested instability, but it was deep in the snowpack and it took a lot of taps. And I'm just going to kind of play this snowpack test. It's not from this case study, but it just is an example where you can see we start with a variety of loading steps, first from the wrist, then from the elbow, and then from the shoulder. And while low scores and lighter taps obviously correlate to greater instability and chances of triggering avalanches than the hard ones, I think, my take home is if I'm getting unstable results, even in that harder range, I do make the assumption that I will be able to trigger it if I hit a thin spot, or similarly, maybe trench or load the snowpack in the wrong spot. So I think as sledders, we have to consider that our stress bulb may reach deeper in the snowpack with those kind of power and dynamic moves. And there's also those kind of thin spots that are hidden trigger points. Yeah. Okay. So I think it's also essential we review and learn from a bunch of the things that went right in this case. They had a great trip plan. They had all the essential gear. They went out to verify conditions and sought to do that. They had good travel practices. I mean, a bunch of all the rest of the crew was in a safe spot on the ridge. Only one person was exposed to the slope at a time. I would not like to think about what the impact would be if people had been mid-slope when the avalanche was triggered. Might have been a different case study. They had good communication with each other and with the outside world. And one of the things I think is kind of cool about this case is, they made a decision on when to call it quits. Like sometimes you got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. And in this case, remember I said they approached the slope from the top. There was no easy way to get back to the ridge and back to his party. So it was a difficult decision now, obviously rattled after this avalanche. You could consider that maybe he could ride his sled back up, but now there was an icy bed surface right where the slope was the steepest. And sometimes there's that potential for kind of cumulative errors or more things to go wrong after one thing's gone wrong. So it wouldn't be without risk to himself or his snowmobile to kind of roll it on an icy slope there. Didn't want to kind of go around the avalanche in the steep slopes that were adjacent, because now we know, triggering an avalanche in this kind of terrain is definitely possible. So could also boot pack up the slope, and tandem out and leave his sled. But, tandeming out, depending on, how tough the access was, kind of comes with its own risks as well. So because he had a good pre-plan with a helicopter company in town that does have some sled slinging, and that was practiced, he actually called, this wasn't a search and rescue call, just called and paid for a helicopter to sling his sled up to the top of the ridge so you could kind of safely ride out and avoid any more kind of cumulative errors there. They did have a backup plan if they were going to spend the night, or he could boot pack out, those kinds of things. But anyways, I just thought that was interesting to share. And then maybe one of the best things about this is how willing this rider was to reflect and report on this accident, really in quite a timely fashion too, because they really felt it was important to kind of get the word out that, hey, this can still happen in this type of terrain, which I think is really powerful in our community. It takes a lot of courage. So we often talk, this is kind of bringing us right back to the daily process and number 7, reflecting on our day. We often talk about how the backcountry is like a wicked learning environment. It doesn't always provide us feedback. Like obviously in the case of triggering an avalanche, that's feedback. But what if, these guys had ridden that slope twice and decided to go somewhere else and never triggered an avalanche? Were all the decisions we made in the day good, or did we get away with something? And these are the kinds of questions, when was I most at risk? Did I get away with anything? What's the most important information that I collected today? It's this type of continual self-assessment and critique that's a key component of what keeps people riding safely in the backcountry year after year. And then, another part of this post-trip reflection is the opportunity to give back. And that kind of focuses right back on having information available for people to use the next day in their trip plan. So we talked about debriefing and reflecting on the day, but your information that you put in the Mountain Information Network, let's say, it helps provide more data points to build better and more accurate avalanche forecasts. And it can also help crowdsource those really important changes in conditions and help keep your fellow riders safe. It reinforces that culture of sharing and learning, I think. So here's my plug for the Mountain Information Network. A lot of people say, okay, I would like to help and do that, but I don't know how to do snowpack tests and all of those kinds of things. But that's actually not what we're looking for. You don't need to be an avalanche expert. We want you to know that you do have all the skills to be a part of it, because even simple photos like how much new snow did you see? Was it windy or not? Did you see any recent signs of avalanches? Like you could just feel it under your sled. Was it crusty, or was it one of those days where there's just like no base? That is really important information to help with trip planning and making our avalanche forecasts. We really love photos, so want you guys to know, please make those Mountain Information Network posts at the end of the day in your reflection. Okay, so just to wrap things up, I've been going on for quite a while. We want you to use that daily process to frame your backcountry outings. Check out that new flexible forecast system. Yeah, hoping it's going to be a really great tool for everyone this season. When you're doing your trip planning, kind of seek out those visual representations of weather, snowpack, and recent avalanches through kind of social media and the Mountain Information Network. But hopefully you have a few more tips for considering, how to weigh that information. Do those early season gear checks. It's not too late. And once you get into the field, you got to verify conditions and make sure you're having those helmets off, engines off types of discussions. Maybe work hard kind of within your crew and even beyond that, if you're on social media, to help destigmatize people sharing those near misses, and so we can all learn from them. And yeah, debrief and reflect on your day, and please submit to our Mountain Information Network. I think that's me. And if you have any questions about this webinar, please feel free to contact me with my email address there. Brent, are you still there?
I am, Jen. Thank you so much for your time tonight. And when we did this webinar and the first time, we had a couple questions in the chat box there. One was like, well, what if I go out and I read the min and then I saw the same thing the next day? Like, you can still put another min out there. And just because it's not new or different information, that also helps our forecasters and other people understand that, things haven't changed, and maybe it's just as good as it was yesterday, or maybe it's just as bad as it was yesterday. So I think that's a really good note I wanted to add in there, as well as people asking about AST courses, sled specific. Some were multi-users, they skied as well. And they asked, what kind of an AST course should I take? And if you took a sled specific one and a ski one, you're always going to get more out of it. I think more education is better. And if you haven't had an AST course for a long time, it's time to refresh that, because things have changed, and every educator is going to be a little bit different, and you're going to tease out a little bit different information from that course. But thank you so much, Jennifer, for your time. Super appreciate it. And folks, we'd love to have you come back to our next webinars. I just want to pop up one screenshot here. We really appreciate all your folks' passion on and your interest in avalanche safety. You can donate to Avalanche Canada for as little as $10. With that being said, there's tons of resources on our website to help you tune up or learn more about avalanche safety. A great place to start our review is our online avalanche tutorial, Avy Savvy. We'd love to thank you all for your show of interest. We hope you folks have a very enjoyable winter out there and a safe winter, and hope you enjoy yourselves. Thanks you so much again, Jen, and hope everyone has a great season.
Thanks, Brent. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.